Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love. Let's get to it. For the next month, we're going to be examining what I call the choice. What are the major issues of this fall's election that will have a direct and probably long-lasting effect on the direction of our country and perhaps its very character? Our purpose will be to illuminate where the two candidates who seek to be our next commander-in-chief stand on those issues and the implications of the differences between them. Our purpose will not be to tell you how to vote. Rather, it will be to make sure you are fully equipped to appreciate the importance of your vote and to ensure that you cast your ballot with the best information available. We're going to start with one such choice whose ramifications for the kind of country we leave to our children and grandchildren are hard to overstate: immigration. Let's start with what has come to be called the Trump effect. After Donald Trump's surprise election 4 years ago, illegal immigration fell so precipitously that for the first time in memory, government detention centers along the Texas border emptied for months afterwards. This reflected a 70% decline in apprehensions. It was called the Trump effect because aspiring migrants south of the border, who had been attentively listening to Trump's tough campaign rhetoric about coming border walls and crackdowns on illegal immigration, feared they would not be able to stay inside the United States after crossing into it. So they simply didn't bother to come. Mr. Trump is promising more of the same in this election cycle. But there is now in prospect an equal and opposite Biden effect in the offing, one where aspiring migrants south of the border have heard Democratic nominee Joe Biden's campaign promises for essentially open borders, an end to most prosecutions and deportations of those who come here illegally, and myriad inducements to them to do just that. Specifically, Mr. Biden's platform promises the following: a 100-day moratorium on deportations to exempt even most criminal aliens, to be followed by a permanent extension for all but the most hardened criminal alien felons. Use of executive powers immediately to reverse all Trump immigration policies, including an end to border wall construction and the Remain in Mexico pushback policy that requires asylum seekers to be sent back to Mexico while their U.S. asylum claims are adjudicated. An end to federal prosecutions for illegal entry and to requirements that migrants apply for asylum in the first country they transit on their way to the U.S. border. The Biden platform also offers health care, education, and a roadmap to citizenship for illegal immigrants in the United States. These add up to a formula for vastly larger numbers of so-called undocumented immigrants. In other words, the choice is stark. One of the most important facets of a Biden effect would be the almost certain elimination of the threat President Trump made that made a huge difference after the initial Trump effect wore off in the face of sustained opposition to his policies from Democratic lawmakers and judges. Faced as a result in June 2019 with a resurgent, rising tide of illegal immigration from Central America, often in caravans, Mr. Trump told President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador that he would impose ruinous trade tariffs on Mexico unless it deployed the National Guard on its border with Guatemala. AMLO, as he's known, promptly did just that, and has ever since stopped every migrant caravan that has tried to force its way in. As we speak, however, another caravan of would-be illegal immigrants to this country has moved from Honduras and smashed its way into Guatemala. It remains to be seen whether it, too, will be stopped at Mexico's southern border, and if so, for how long. One thing already seems clear, however. It is highly unlikely that a President Biden would maintain Trump's tariff threat against Mexico. That's not Biden's style. It certainly wouldn't be consistent with the broader thrust of his immigration policies. Should that happen, the Mexican government will almost certainly feel no obligation to keep its troops blocking illegal Central American immigrants from transiting Mexico to come here. They will be redeployed after the November election, and when they are, the consequences are predictable. Overnight, Mexico would become once again a migrant superhighway. The caravans will form and roll through, wave after wave. The first caravan waves would then not only reach the U.S. border, they would likely find their way across it newly unimpeded as well. Successive population waves, seeing the vanguard succeed unhindered, would pour through the breach for as long as those too are unopposed. The political and policy effects of such mass demographic shifts will be far-reaching and difficult to reverse. As just an example, in the United Kingdom, the former Prime Minister Tony Blair deliberately changed the demography of his country by opening the door to mass migration from South Asia. And the rest, as they say, is history. We'll discuss all this and more. The Center for Immigration Studies, Todd Bensman, shortly. But first, we're going to get an intelligence briefing on another momentous challenge, the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party. Stay tuned for our update with one of the 7th Fleet's former duty expert, Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired. Captain Fennell is one of our go-to guys on matters involving not just the military threat that China poses, but also the degree to which it is now pursuing hybrid warfare and other techniques for taking us down. Stay tuned for more with Captain Jim Fennell straight ahead. We're back, and it is a distinct pleasure to say we are joined by one of the men I admire most for his extended service to our country in the uniform of the United States Navy. His name is Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired. He is one of our country's most competent and insightful intelligence practitioners. He brought those skills to bear on behalf of America's national security for 30 years. in naval intelligence, including serving as the former Director of Intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. These days, he is a senior fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, not to be confused with ours here in Washington. He's also a member of the Committee on the Present Danger, China. Captain Fennell, thank you so much for joining us at Securing America. It's great to have you with us, sir.
It's an honor to be here, Frank, and congratulations on the new show.
Thank you. Jim, you have spent most of your professional life, I think it's fair to say, studying and trying to effectively assess what Communist China, and specifically the Chinese Communist Party that runs it, is about. And you have chronicled over that period its transition from a relatively backwards military and impoverished nation into a very formidable power. The question I want to put to you, because I think it's central to our conversation today for sure, but arguably to this election and the future of our country, is the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, our enemy?
Yes, Frank, I believe that it is. I think they are on a strategy to essentially displace the United States as the new world leader and to implement their own form of global governance that Xi Jinping talks about all the time, a community of common destiny for mankind that's centered around, Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. And I think that's something that we need to be really concerned about.
How would you characterize what he's also called his China dream, Jim?
Yeah, the China dream is, it's got two audiences. Obviously, the internal audience in China to maintain the Chinese Communist Party control over the people of China. But for external audiences, it's a message to us that says we're going to put ourselves in charge of the global system. And part of that is to restore the territory that we believe was stolen from us over time. Obviously, they think Taiwan is theirs. They think the South China Sea is theirs. They think the East China Sea is theirs, and the Senkaku Islands, parts of the lower Ryukyu Islands that are Japan's territory. They have disputes on their own southern border with India that they've just in June been fighting with the Indians over again. They have disputes with Mongolia. They have disputes with Russia. And so China is part of their great rejuvenation, is a great restoration. And so part of what we need to be worried about is how do they restore themselves territorially? And I believe that they want to use soft power to get there, but they have prepared hard power to be able to achieve their goal.
And even talked about having the ability through biological weapons specifically to depopulate this country and to take it over. And that one of the techniques that the Chinese would use to try to accomplish that would be that they would actually sort of have a feint that suggested to us that they were focused on Taiwan and they were going to be, taking down Taiwan, but actually they would be coming after us. Do you credit those kinds of comments? And if so, does the military that you're no longer part of, Jim, in the United States today as well?
I think China looks at things through what they call comprehensive national power. And so they approach their adversaries, which is the United States, through all elements of national power. So that would include areas like biological warfare. It includes the economy. It includes psychological warfare. It includes information warfare. It includes lawfare. And then it also obviously includes hard power that they have in their military that we can talk about as well. But all elements are tied together, led by the party. And it's developed what they call scientific development. And so they have study groups and work groups that are examining each one of these areas and doing game theory to figure out, if I do this and the United States or the Allies do this, then how would we respond? And they'll play these scenarios out in every facet of every one of these soft power to hard power arenas. And then they link it all together, all focused on getting to their strategic objective, which is to say they're in control and they're running the show and they're dictating to the world how they must live.
And when you say running the show, you mean worldwide. I mean, this is a global
Yes.
aspiration. That China dream is not confined to what Xi Jinping does inside China itself. And the trouble with that, of course, Jim, is that they seem to be inexorably moving forward with the realization of that dream. And I wanted to talk to you about something that I know you're following closely from overseas, and that is the so-called Belt and Road Initiative of Xi Jinping. What's that about? How is it faring? And what are its implications strategically?
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative, or what was originally termed the One Belt, One Road Initiative by Xi Jinping in 2013, is his manifestation of this great rejuvenation in the economic arena, whereby they expand China's influence. Primarily, they started out through South Asia, through the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean, into Pakistan, into Bangladesh and other smaller countries. But it's now expanded into the Mediterranean, and it's expanding down into the South Pacific, and it's expanding into the Arctic. And its design is to essentially put Chinese businesses that are maybe struggling a bit through their own interactions with the United States in this current administration, but they're trying to expand their business interests across the world, and so that they're trying to establish a new way of doing business. They established a new Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is to compete with the World Bank. It isn't, in fact, in reality, but that's the goal with that. And they're also, as we've seen, moving their military forces out into these areas, and they've established a military base in Djibouti, and they're working those conduits, if you will, in these other countries where their business interests are essentially leading to be followed by their military. And so this is a goal that they have. There's a lot of debate right now on how effective it is, and there's.
Well, let's hope so.
I don't
Jim.
see.
Let's hope so, because we need very much to have this not, in fact, metastasize further, especially to the extent that it enables the projection of power by the Chinese Communist Party. We're going to talk next with Jim Finnell about whether Americans are waking up to this danger right after this. We're back, and we're going to continue a conversation that I think is about as important as any one can have at the moment, because it addresses the existential threat to freedom of our generation, and it's coming from the Chinese Communist Party. Our guest is Captain Jim Fennell, United States Navy retired, one of the most knowledgeable men on that threat, and a man who has been warning about it for decades. Jim, you must take some heart from the fact that it seems as though, after all these years, the weight of the evidence that you saw over the horizon, as they say, is now sufficiently obvious that even people in political life in this country are beginning to say, this is a problem. Notably, last week, the House Task Force on China, as it's called, made up of Republicans, because apparently the Democratic Party chose not to participate. They have issued a very important report. I'd be interested in your take on both its findings and perhaps what it signals about where we are as a nation in terms of waking up to this danger.
Well, Frank, I am very heartened after all these years to start to see the amount of change that's going on in the country, to recognize the existential threat from the Chinese Communist Party. And I think it's important to differentiate between the Chinese Communist Party and the rest of the Chinese people. And I know that our administration has been very clear about making that distinction. This report that you've mentioned, about 120 pages, called the China Task Force Report, essentially had four major themes, and the first one is the most important in my opinion, which is, it says we must stop ignoring the Chinese Communist Party's communist ideology. And for so long, we haven't talked about the ideology of communism and what the Chinese Communist Party stands for. And this report outlines some of the malicious things that the party stands for and what they're doing. The second area is it talks about how once we recognize this ideology, that we need to also understand that it affects every American's life. And many times I'll hear people say, well, what do we care about a bunch of rocks in the South China Sea? Or what do we care about the Senkakus in the East China Sea? What do we care about Taiwan? That's an internal civil war between China and the former KMT and now the Taiwan government. But the reality is, what goes on in these areas affects Americans' lives in many, many ways, principally through our economy. $5 trillion worth of goods travel through the South China Sea.
Wow.
And the PRC's ability to interrupt that has a direct bearing on the people that manufacture and buy and sell things in America, let alone what it means to the international global trading system that affects Americans' life. The third area they talk about is how we need to talk about how China and the Chinese Communist Party are eroding the international system. They have played havoc with the international forum in terms of how we resolve disputes in international forums. They've mismanaged and co-opted the World Health Organization. They've disobeyed and violated World Trade Organization rules. And in maritime arena, they've ignored the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea and essentially taken the South China Sea into their own possession.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of areas where the proof is that they're destroying the international order, which is the order that America fought for in World War II and has benefited the largest amount of people in the history of mankind. And then finally, the report says it's a call to action, a generational call to action to the people of America. And the report puts out, 82 key findings and over 400 specific items, and I'd encourage people to read it. And it's really a seed change from what we heard last year, for instance, in July 3rd, when we had several of the existing China hands, the experts, the so-called experts that, wrote a letter to President Trump and said, China's not the enemy.
Yeah.
And see, these people have been wrong for 40 years, and it's time for them to go in a new generation.
Jim, let me just point out, too, that I think it probably isn't coincidental, but just as this House Republican China task force was issuing these important findings, including that, we need to break the monopoly on power of the Chinese Communist Party, Adam Schiff, who has been the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee for some time and has spent almost the entirety of that time, as far as I can tell, focused very narrowly on, I think, frankly, inflated characterizations of the threat from Russia. Not that it isn't a threat certainly in the nuclear space particularly, but in terms of the political interference in our elections and the Russia hoax and so on. But he has suddenly awakened in an article published recently in Foreign Affairs magazine to the fact that the intelligence community of the United States needs to be massively realigned to focus on the problem that you've spent your life addressing. Tell us what to make of Adam Schiff's findings, as well as his call for action on the part of your former colleagues in the IC.
Well, I try to stay out of the political arena, but I'm happy to see anybody join the fight if this is really truly what he's intending. I thought the title of his article was quite interesting. It said it's called "The U.S. Intelligence Community is Not Prepared for the China Threat." And for decades, many of us that were out in the fleet and forward deployed and were looking at China from the front row seats were questioning the kinds of analysis that was going on in the intelligence community back in Washington. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad to see that he's on board. I think we need a bipartisan effort to really get after China, because it's not a political threat in terms of it's not something that one party or the other should feel that they own. It is a national threat, and China means to displace the United States, and they don't care what party we're in.
Amen.
They don't like us.
Let me just ask you in closing, given all that you've said, Jim, and I think you've very accurately described what we're facing in the way of this challenge from China, and it is heartening that we're seeing signs of bipartisanship, if not at the presidential candidate level, perhaps at the congressional level, in terms of addressing this threat. What do you say to those who are still insisting, capitalists and financiers notably among them, that we need to continue to underwrite China and otherwise enable its strengthening? Very quickly.
Every dollar that goes to China, you can guarantee that at least 6 to 10 cents, maybe more, go to the PLA and go to those elements of their national government that are designed to defeat and kill American soldiers, sailors, and airmen. That's just in the military arena.
And perhaps the rest of us as well. Jim, I'm afraid we are out of time, but thank you for this important warning. You've been issuing it for a long time. It's never more needed now. And I hope that what we're talking about in this election is a mandate for the President of the United States, whoever that may be, to take this seriously and act robustly towards the Chinese Communist. Talk with Todd Bensman about the choice on immigration right after this. Welcome back. Glad you're with us. We're talking in this segment about something I discussed a little bit earlier in my monologue, namely the choice that we're facing specifically in this coming presidential election on policies and programs involving immigration. And we have a superb guest on to talk about these things, a man who has studied them and practiced them, for that matter, in a successive career of journalism, as an intelligence officer with the Texas Department of Public Safety, and now with the indispensable Center for Immigration Studies. He is its Texas-based Senior National Security Fellow. His name is Todd Bensman. He is the author of the forthcoming book, America's Covert Border War, the untold story of the nation's battle to prevent jihadist infiltration. It's due to be out in early next year. It's so good to have you with us, Todd Bensman. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Frank.
So, if you would, Todd, talk a little bit about how you see the differences between Donald Trump on the one hand and Joe Biden on the other on this multifaceted challenge of border security and interior immigration law enforcement.
I think that there's a high likelihood that if we have a President Biden, that very shortly after the election, we should start to see the beginnings of the next mass migration crisis. I don't mean to be alarmist or dystopian here or anything like that, but I base this on the Biden campaign's promises for immigration policy south of us, and also on my own interviews on the ground among the migrants in Guatemala and Mexico who told me that they are waiting for a Democratic replacement to Donald Trump so that they can then make their march to the border. They think it'll become very easy once Trump is gone and that there's a Biden in office. Biden has promised to eliminate and reverse all of Trump's policies that have had the effect of disincentivizing migration from Central America. He's promised a moratorium on all deportations for the first 100 days. He's promised to undo MPP, the Wait in Mexico policy that has been very effective at reducing the incentives for the migrant caravans to come. And the migrants tell you straight up, they'll tell you if you ever ask them, we're waiting for Democrats to take office and then we're coming. And we'll come in large numbers.
So when you look at this, again, it's just common sense after all, but Todd, we're talking about whether we will have, it seems, a program that is riddled with incentives to people to come to our country, illegally, if need be, versus a policy that says you're not going to be allowed in, and if you do manage to get in and we catch you, you are going to be expelled. It's hard to say that that choice could be any more stark. Give us a sense of what the implications of it are, because I mentioned in my monologue what we saw happen in Great Britain, where then Prime Minister Tony Blair essentially engineered mass migration from South Asia into the United Kingdom with profound and continuing, I think, deleterious effects. How do you see what the choice might be if we actually opt for the open borders and, no enforcement of our immigration laws otherwise approach?
You have to remember that in the aspiring migrant community, people that are waiting to are calculating their personal decisions as to whether or not to migrate, that it is incredibly sensitive, the grapevine, the communications grapevine, especially over social media, as to what American leadership is messaging about policies that will make it easier or harder to come in. So they're listening and they're hearing this. And when Trump was messaging during the 2015-2016 campaign, we are going to stop illegal immigration cold, and here are all the things we're going to do, including building the wall and a variety of other kind of policies, that resulted in what we later came to call the Trump effect. Right now, we've got the Biden administration all through the primary campaign and even into after he became the nominee, messaging what we could call a Biden effect, which is that it will be open borders. You come to the U.S. border and we will welcome you in with free health care, welfare benefits, food and aid assistance, asylum, and most importantly, a pathway to citizenship, which is promised as a key cornerstone of the Biden campaign. Well, this messaging is heard loud and clear already. And so we're starting to see thousands and thousands of migrants already pooling up inside Mexico, Guatemala. We've got caravans that are forming right now, waiting to come in, hoping that in 30 days' time, times will have changed. I want to point out one other very important, if I have a minute.
Yes, just a minute.
Policy, which is the Mexican National Guard deployment on the Mexican border, which has provided this very effective military cordon against northward migration. That was in place due to a Trump threat to the Mexican president of progressive trade tariffs. I can't see Biden persisting in Trump's threat to penalize Mexico economically for not keeping that troop deployment down there. Once those troops are put back in the barracks, it is open highway, super highway, just like always.
Well, and there's evidence, I think, that things are not going well in Mexico, which might give rise to the president's calculation that maybe he may want to have more of his own people come north as well. So this is a very important choice, needless to say, and whether we get it right or not, whether it results in a wall across that southern border against all comers, for example, and the enforcement of the law, or more of a tractor beam operating, is one of the things we're going to be watching closely. Thank you so much. Todd Bensman, come back to us again next week if you would. We'll be right back with more right after this. Welcome back. We're going to pivot to the Middle East, area of the world that our next guest has focused on intensively in a number of important positions inside and outside of the United States government. His name is David Wurmser. He served as a Middle East advisor to then U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney. He also has served as a special assistant to John Bolton of the State Department. He's been at the American Enterprise Institute as a fellow there, as well as the Center for Security Policy, where he is, I'm very pleased to say these days, directing a new project on anti-Semitism and the U.S.-Israel relationship and how we might strengthen it. David Wurmser, it's so good to have you with us. Welcome to Securing America.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here.
I want to talk about a couple of things with you, if we can, David. Starting with Iran. You have spent most of your professional life, I think it's fair to say, grappling with the strategic challenge posed to us by the mullahocracy, if you will, of Iran, now in its 40th year, relentlessly hostile to this country and to, well, most of the rest of the free world for that matter. How would you characterize the conditions at the moment inside Iran, subsequent to the end of this so-called Iran deal at President Trump's hands and the reestablishment of at least some of the sanctions that were in place previously?
I would characterize it as rather abysmal. The sanctions that we are reimposing, while they're not internationally based anymore because the UN has not cooperated with us at all on extending the sanctions that were imposed, they still have very significant effect for the very simple reason that companies and governments who want to deal with the United States have to make a choice between the United States and Iran. And in an economic way, with the exception of a few companies, it's clear what the choice would be. Second, they need financial structures through which to operate to deal with Iran. And again, the same issue will occur, which is the banking structure ultimately relies on the United States, access to the United States. So only a few banks and structures would be able to service their payments and credit lines and so on and so forth. So I think our sanctions will have a big effect, or continue to have a big effect. And until now, it was a pity that the international community didn't go along, because Iran's internal situation, because of these sanctions in part, is truly abysmal.
Yeah. Well, our hope has been for a long time that it would be sufficiently abysmal that the people of Iran would be able to free themselves from this regime that, of course, oppresses them and threatens us, as I said. But David, it hasn't happened so far, and I'm very concerned, I must say, that when you look at what the Chinese are up to now in Iran, and more generally, we were talking earlier in the program about the existential threat from China, its involvement with another dangerous regime is very worrisome indeed. Talk a little bit about that, if you would, and in particular, the evidence that there's now deployment of at least intelligence personnel from China in Iran proper.
Yes. Well, when you talk about the Iranian people, they're worried. They have divorced from their government mentally. They have risen up again and again and again. We've seen this in 2008. We've seen it in 2002 and 3. We've seen it at the end of the 90s. We've seen it recently, even with riots and so forth. The problem the Iranian people have is they have a regime that still has the will to kill, and they know it. Now, they take risks even with that. But at the end of the day, what really bothers the Iranians and deters them from continuing in a much more aggressive way to challenge their regime is the feeling that the rug will be pulled out from under them by the international community. And this is exactly where the real damage of the Chinese deal is being done. It re-legitimizes a government that, frankly, for the last 4 years, has faced tremendous delegitimization. So I think that China right now is bartering such forms of legitimation with various really dangerous actors in exchange for international support for their attempt to prove that their system is superior to ours. And by that, I don't only mean communism, but the Chinese Belt and Road.
Oh, I think we may have just lost David Wormser.
No, I'm still.
There you are.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, David. Welcome back.
Thank you. No, I mean, the Chinese basically are trying to barter their involvement in these regimes for legitimacy of their role in the international system or domination.
So, David, when you look at what the Chinese are doing, and by the way, it's not confined just to buying oil they're not supposed to be buying. It's not just confined to, putting intelligence personnel and probably other People's Liberation Army personnel on the ground there in proximity, among other things, to the mouth of the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, which is, of course, a lifeline for energy for lots of countries around the world, not so much us, thankfully. But there's also this problem that the Chinese are working on other mechanisms to end run the kinds of restrictions that you're talking about.
Yes.
And if they, in fact, start engaging on the sale of conventional arms to the Iranian regime, my guess is that this is going to make it just that much more emboldened, not just more dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. The Iranian regime will be much more aggressive. They'll feel that somewhat the box they're in is loosened. The intelligence cooperation you mentioned is very significant because Iran, as we see, unfortunately, has a very dangerous intelligence structure in Europe and Latin America and Africa.
And here, we're told as well, unfortunately. Yeah.
Exactly.
David, hold the thought, because we have to take a pause here for just a second. When we come back, I want to talk about Iran, yes, but another of the countries that China is also making common cause with. As you say, it seems to be engaging with really all of the world's most dangerous regimes. And one is a putative ally of the United States, if you can believe it, a country known as Turkey. We're going to talk about that and more with David Wormser right after this. We're back, and we're joined again by David Wormser, who has served his country with distinction, among other things, as an aide to then Vice President Dick Cheney, specializing in the Middle East. And that's the topic we're going to continue to address with a slightly expanded perspective. That is, the country that is not regarded, at least officially, as a hostile power, as Iran and China certainly are, but as an ally, and yet under its leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, it's actually anything but. The country, of course, is Turkey, and we're going to talk about it in a way that I hope will make clear why we had better get this right, because this is a problem for our security interests and that of all Americans, I'm afraid, as well. So, David, talk a little bit about this fellow Erdogan. He's been the leader of Turkey in various incarnations for a while now. Why is he such a problem, and how is that problem manifesting itself?
Erdogan is a problem largely because of the ideology that he has. He formed the AK party, the Peace and Justice Party in Turkey, and what that really is a sort of a Muslim Brotherhood party. Believes in a fairly radical interpretation of Islam and is very aggressive in pursuing the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, where for those who are exposed to it understand this is not a very limited philosophy. This is a global, one of those ideologies with global aspirations. So I think you really have to look at Erdogan in that way. And once you look at him through that filter, what you begin to see, his statements make sense from his point of view. His grandiose statements about Turkey now being one of the greatest powers in the world, will be a peer power with the United States and Russia and China, making it one of the top 4 superpowers on the globe. He talks about Europe and retaking the Islamic territories of the world that have been Islamic before. So it's beyond his neo-Ottoman. His foreign minister coined the phrase neo-Ottomanism, which is odd in itself. It's the only country in the world that openly, overtly espouses a return to imperialism. Yeah. But he's beyond that. He actually is claiming territories that were never part of the Ottoman Empire.
This is troubling, needless to say. It bespeaks what I guess you might call an ideology. It's got a patina of religiosity to it. I think of it as Sharia supremacism, and that is this belief that it's God's will that the whole world will be submitting to Sharia under the leadership of somebody like him, a caliph, I think. To the extent that this is what's operating, David, give us just a quick sort of tour d'horizon as to where it is manifesting itself now, which is both very expansive and it seems growing by the day.
Well, if you draw a circle around Turkey about 3,000-4,000 miles, and you look where on that circle he's pushing out, you'll find it's everywhere. We see on one side, going all the way to the east, you see him trying to radicalize the Muslims of India. He is trying to whip up a Pakistani-Indian war over Kashmir. He, in the UN, tried to instigate it. He and his agents have been caught in India, operating in the Muslim community in India to radicalize it, which is horrifying because there are 200 million Muslims in India. Right. Go all the way to the west, apart from claiming Gibraltar, which would make the Mediterranean a Turkish lake. He also is funding European parties, 2 types. One are the Turkish expatriates in Europe, of which there are many, based on his Turkish AK party, and others which are the Muslim Brotherhood movements in Europe, which he is funding. There's one from France et Musulman, party, for example, and so forth. So we see that. And down south, you go to Eritrea. He claims all the way down to the Bab el-Mandeb Straits and so forth.
Even
so
in Nigeria, I understand he's backing ISIS and Boko Haram down there. And it's not just confined to those places. Armenia is now engaged in a conflict with Azerbaijan that the Turks seem to be engaging further in trying to radicalize the Muslim community there. And you mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood, David. I just want to come back to that because the Muslim Brotherhood is a problem in this country as well. And is it correct to say that it is under essentially the operational control here of Turkey and Erdogan? And what does that mean if it is?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's the funding structures. The funding structures are being provided by Qatar, but they're going through Turkey for Turkey's purpose. And that's the core strategic relationship. The money sources Qatar and Turkey is the operational head. And yes, Turkey is essentially operationally controlling a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood movements around the world, including in the United States. If you look at some of the key forces at work here on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood, you'll see deep ties to the Turkish regime. You also see the Turkish regime in Washington with a tremendous amount of lobbying effort. I would expect it to be one of the greatest lobbying efforts Washington's ever seen.
And this is in part why we continue to mistake it as an ally when it has simply ceased to be one. And I guess the other is that it's a member of NATO, but there isn't any effective way to remove a NATO ally who isn't actually one any longer. But I just wanted to close out on this because I think it's vitally important for our audience to understand in terms of the enemy within, which is, of course, a topic that we hit on a lot here. If the Muslim Brotherhood is doing the bidding of the Turks and is enabled by the Turks with their financial support, with their political support, with their logistical support to become even more aggressively Sharia supremacist, that is going to be a problem for America, not just for our interests elsewhere around the world. Very quick thought.
Oh, absolutely. We see in Europe the rise of Sharia areas in various cities and so forth. If we don't begin to make the point very clear that everybody's welcome here, but if they live by the rules that the American system has been based on for 200 years, then fine. But
that's the vital distinction, and we're certainly seeing in Turkey, in Erdogan, in the Brotherhood, in their agenda, among others, that it's not about playing by our rules, and that's what must be changed. Thank you so much, David Wormser. Great to have you with us. Thanks for the work you do at the Center for Security Policy. Come back to us soon. I hope the rest of you will do so tomorrow as well. Thank you.
continues to look and feel as well as he does today, our hope is that we can plan for a discharge as early as tomorrow to the White House, where he can continue his treatment course.
The president continues to be treated for COVID-19 at Walter Reed Memorial today, but could he return to the White House sooner than expected? Meanwhile, the Washington, D.C.